confirmation proceedings and some concerns about some of his previous behavior. But nonetheless, other than that, you just don't hear from the courts. It's just what it is. Now again, every now and again you'll hear about a high-profile issue, but it's not the judges themselves. What it'll be rather is really the issue. So is there an abortion case in front of the Supreme Court? Is there a death penalty case in front of the Supreme Court? Is there a high-profile antitrust case in front of the Supreme Court? These are the kinds of things you think about. Okay, now how do groups use the media? Well, actually we talked a lot about this. When you think about press release, press conference, news conference, which again is a little rare and staged, right? But organizations do it, but they also buy time. So interest groups can buy advertising. You think about Habitat for Humanity, you think about the American Cancer Society, corporations do it all the time, right? They try to get their slogans out, right? Beef, if it's what's for dinner, pork, the other white meat, milk, got milk, those kinds of things. So groups, you do the exact same thing. So interestingly enough, the commercial world is learning a lot from the political world about some of the, or maybe even a little bit of vice versa there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the media and the public in the political arena here. Okay, now, as we had mentioned before, the original print media really catered to the elite. And what we've seen since is really not a whole lot of change from that. Okay, and this is bothersome, right? What we see is the print media catering to the elite, and that allows for the elite to be better informed, right? The print media is noteworthy for covering facts and a much broader scale, much more detail, whereas radio and television kind of targets the emotion, right? Now, a lot of this deals with constraints, right? Radio, television, there's a sharp time constraint, when time is money, of course. And with newspapers, print, or the internet version of the print media, they have a little bit more space than TV and radio stations have time, if you will, if you needed a comparison. Now, one of the problems we have with this is that if the elite are able to and are catered to by the print media, what does that say about the lower socioeconomic groups? Are they not being served by the print media well enough to become as informed as the elite, right? That they're watching radio and television. Now, there are two ways to look at this. Is that just what the lower socioeconomic groups want to focus on? Is that where they want to get their news, while the elite focuses on the print media and that's where they want to get their news? Or is it that the print media is not meeting the needs of the lower socioeconomic groups, all right? And then taking it one step further, maybe television and radio isn't meeting the needs of the elite, okay? Now again, the problem that we have, of course, is that there is one group that's much better informed than the other. Okay, so let's just look a little bit at campaigns, all right? Now, a lot of people think the media has a lot of power. It does, but it doesn't have enough power to really control campaigns. So probably one of the reasons for this is really the raw competition. So if you get just back to our easy little paradigm, if you will, Fox News on the right, MSNBC on the left, CNN somewhere in the middle, there's probably so much competition in the media that no one outlet would really be able to sway an election, and there's positive coverage of one candidate and negative coverage of another. Okay, front runners, of course, always do a little bit better. They get that free media coverage. That's also important. Okay, but what is it that we do know? Okay, in regard to negative coverage, it grossly outweighs the positive coverage. This is something that we know, all right? So believe it or not, regardless of the angle the media is taking, that's true of print, that's true of radio, television, internet sources, the negative is much more voluminous than the positive coverage. Not to say you don't see some positive, all right? Now the question becomes really, whose fault is that? Is that the media's fault for reporting all this negative coverage? Or on the flip side, all right, is the media just reporting what's out there? That is to say, when it comes to politics, and then let me just make that clear, we're just focusing on politics right now, how can you hold the media responsible if all they're doing merely is just reporting one candidate's attack against another. Whose fault is that really? Okay. Now, when it comes to paid advertising, another thing we can say here, right? And there are two things actually we can say, although they're much related. Number one, the paid advertising is also more negative than it is positive. Okay, and number two, it seems to work, right? They are related. So one of the things you hear from people all the time is, I hate all the negative attacks, and I hate all the negative campaigns, and I hate the paid negative ads, right? Whether it be TV, radio, online. Of course, you can't open up a website anymore without some pop-up coming up advertising something, especially during the campaign season. This last one, it really did get obnoxious, but the reality is that we all seem to hate it, but it is incredibly effective, right? So you see that, we just talked about negative generally outweighing the positive, but also when it comes to paid advertising, the negative also outweighs the positive. And the reason that that's done, regardless of how much people dislike it, is incredibly effective. So you see a lot more money being spent by candidates attacking their opponents as opposed to saying how positive their points of view are and what they can do. Now, you add to that mix, of course, super PACs that we talked about earlier after the Citizens United decision, and it's really becoming overwhelming. We're actually going to revisit that later on when we get into political parties. Now, debates, of course, I find to be absolutely fascinating. Debates, of course, have become much more negative. They have for quite some time. The first televised presidential debate, of course, is in 1960. And we've made mention of this before, but you have the very debonair, very handsome candidate Kennedy at that time, and Richard Nixon, who was the incumbent vice president. He was President Eisenhower's vice president running for office. And if you ever look at the video, you'll see Nixon not really comfortable with the camera, not nearly as handsome as Senator Kennedy at the time. And of course, the camera caught him just kind of with his eyes moving around a little bit too much. They looked a little squirrely. Now, Nixon was also a twice-a-day shaver, all right? So he had also had some 5 o'clock shadow growing in, and it just did not look nearly like what President Kennedy did. Now, there's been a lot of research over the years, and regardless of what group that is that they use as a study group, right, as a focus group, if you watch the video of the debate, well, he said, well, President Kennedy won, right, or candidate Kennedy, Senator Kennedy at the time. If you listen to it on radio, those who did think Nixon won that, right? So maybe substance versus appearance there, right? Now, regardless of that, all candidates have learned from that 1960 televised presidential debate, where it became very, very clear that appearance was as, if not more important than really the message. And again, this is something that adds towards a lack of positivity, if you will. I mean, you'd like to think that American politics should all be about the ideas and what's best for country, the people, etc. But maybe appearance is a little bit better, as well as negative advertising. Okay, now when it comes to global issues, we do have 24/7 news coverage. It's almost inescapable. Network television's on all the time. Newsprint. Our print sources are published all around the world: New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. You can get it just about anywhere. And of course, with those print sources now having websites, web platforms, it's pretty easy to get that content everywhere. Now, this has caused a little bit of backlash, again, because a lot of these large media sources are American-owned. The one exception that I mentioned there would be, of course, the Financial Times, a British publication, but you can get it anywhere. I mean, it's everywhere, right? You can get it anywhere. And some people have called this the Americanization of media, or McGlobalization of media. Again, tying everything negative to McDonald's, I guess. All right, but you get the idea. Now, all countries, of course, are very proud of their culture and their own bits of news, but again, you're getting this very heavy American dose. Now, again, when I've traveled, I'll be honest. I mean, if I want to see what's going on back at home, I will look at my traditional news sources. I will look at Wall Street Journal. I'll look at my local newspapers, and if I want to turn something on, I'm probably not going to turn on the BBC. I'll turn on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or something like that. That's more me. It's what I'm used to. Okay, now, one other curveball that I want to throw in here is just a little bit on narrowcasting. Now, again, this is a good thing, all right, with all, at least in my opinion, with all of the competition out there, and us talking several times about the reality that if there's something you want to see, if there's a point of view, you can go get it. Narrowcasting is just that. So where you get TV, radio, newsprint that focuses on a particular group. And it could be based on demographics. It could also be based on language. There are Spanish language television stations, news networks, TV, radio and print as well. But also political viewpoints. All right, so you can mix all those three, all right, demographics, language, and political point of view. Okay. So again, we're seeing more of that. Now again, it does lend to that, more so to that concept that if there's something you want to see, and you can certainly get a hold of it. Okay, citizen journalism. I find this kind of exciting. You know, we're all becoming journalists in some way. So you think about all the ways in which we can glom on to some type of some issue and report about it, right? So we can blog if we want, we can write a post, we can do all sorts of things, right? One of the reasons why you're seeing so much more, and even publishing is cheaper now than it's ever been. So you think about all the ways in which, you know, we can you know, express our point of view or report on things. That's why you're seeing, due to low cost, ease of access, things like that, you're seeing more and more citizen journalism. Okay, and the question is whether it's effective or not, and it looks like it is, right? Especially the more local the issue, all right? So you think about a school levy or a bond issue, or changing zoning, or whether a village or a city needs to annex a particular neighboring area of a township. Again, it seems to be very, very effective at the local level, not so much at the large level. Citizen journalism almost always a single issue based. Very rarely do you find a multitude of issues. Okay, now a couple things just on concentration and centralization of ownership. Now, there's a grave concern among a lot of people, certainly that do what I do for a living, but political scientists, media, that it's getting a little too easy to own multiple sources of media, multiple TV stations, radio stations, newspapers, right? And the problem with that is that with less competition, you have fewer viewpoints, okay? Now, if we had to argue one way or the other, I think print is probably in in the gravest zone, if you will. Many cities really have, even large cities have one newspaper. They're down to one newspaper, and in that area, that owner of the newspaper may own a few radio stations and television stations. There isn't really a whole lot in the way of antitrust law that prevents that. There's a little bit there, but there really isn't a lot. Now, if you think about a competitive news market, that's really where an area has multiple sources, right? Competition means more newspapers, right? More than one. News stations that aren't owned by the same person. Radio stations that aren't owned by the same person. Now, news monopoly is just the opposite, right? News monopolies, a single firm owns all the media, right? They own the newspaper, the radio station, the TV stations, etc. Okay, again, very, very a huge source of concern. What we want to preserve, if we can, is diversity. Now, what a lot of people have called diversity in terms of viewpoints, but what a lot of people have called for is that maybe antitrust law should be extended to breaking up some of that type of control, but to this day it really hasn't. Okay, just a little bit in the way of government regulations. Now, again, there are almost nothing right? There is almost nothing in regard to what government can do to limit what the media chooses to print, publish, etc. Okay, the usual point of conflicts, so just looking at conflicts, is where the government wants to keep something top secret. Perhaps they want to keep troop movements or covert operations secret or private. There is a statute, a federal statute, that prohibits the publication of materials that are considered classified. However, just because there's a federal statute there does not necessarily mean that if the government got wind of a potential publication, that they're going to be able to go to court to get an injunction. If you remember a long time ago, we talked about the national security exception to the First Amendment right of free press, and although it exists, the Supreme Court hasn't found a case whereby they should apply it, right? So you think about the Pentagon Papers case that we mentioned several weeks ago. That's about as close as it's going to get. And if the Supreme Court didn't want to enjoin newspapers from publishing then, I don't know what they would. All right, now, with that said, when it comes to conflicts, there really isn't much the government can do. I mean, they can always try, and the best thing a government can do if they really want to prohibit something from being published is make sure the media doesn't get it. All right? Not always possible. You can try to prevent leaks, but not always possible. Now, just a little bit on the right to privacy. Now, we're looking from this point of view, looking at the person who's being reported about, right? So the person who's being covered, right? In a news story, TV story, radio story. When it comes to the right to privacy, there are really two sets of rules. One that apply to public figures, those that apply to non-public figures. Public figures would be people like celebrities, sports athletes, politicians of all walks of life, and one kind of a narrow category, but one that I'll mention anyway, criminal defendants while they are criminal defendants. So, when it comes to public figures, right, they are deemed to have a lesser expectation of privacy, right? So, in other words, for our purposes here, now again, if this were a media law class, we'd spend a lot more time with it. But for our purposes here, a lot more can be said about public figures, right? There really aren't much in the way of boundaries, okay? For non-private figures, all right, or I'm sorry, non-public figures, private figures rather, these are people that they have a little bit more of an expectation of privacy. However, the reality is once the media wants to print it, chances are they're not going to be stopped from printing whatever it is they want to do. Now, having said that, which we rely on more so, especially in print, but also in radio and televisions, we rely on that actual station or newspaper to really enforce its own code of conduct. So you think about the names of rape victims or juvenile criminal defendants. If the media wanted to report their names, the media absolutely can. All right, there's nothing that stops them whatsoever. However, most say, you know what, this is not the right thing to do, we won't do it. And the same thing is true when it comes to troop movements or covert operations. You know, maybe they have the wherewithal to print it or report on it, but they just won't do so. All right. Okay, now when it comes to rules in regard to content and ownership, kind of tying a lot of this together, there's really almost no limitation, okay? Even public figures, if they want to win a libel lawsuit, that is, say something was printed about them that was wrong, how can they win a lawsuit? They'd actually have to show ill will, which is the legal phrase for that is actual malice. It's very, very difficult to prove, okay? Now, when it comes to ownership, the Communications Act of 1934, a very old statute, still good law today, of course, started with radio stations, but it was quickly amended to include television stations. It doesn't really put a whole lot of limitation on the concentration issue, right? That is to say, it's not really an antitrust statute, but it does declare that the airwaves are public domain. You do have to get a broadcast license to license, and of course they do look at licenses in a way they want some diversity. So let's say there's, in our neck of the woods, there are 40 potential radio licenses. I mean, can you imagine a world with 40 country music radio stations? But you get the idea, right? That they'll try to make it a little bit diverse. So in the application for the license, they do the radio station or television station, though again, with television, it's not that nearly that big of a deal with the advent of cable TV and satellite TV. I mean, it's very, very easy, right? Free TV as we know it, kind of maybe on its way out in some respect, which is unfortunate. But in your license application, you do have to say your format, spell out your format, what it is you're going to deliver on, and you have to stick to it. Now, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 deregulated a lot of things. It made concentration of ownership even easier because, again, the Communications Act really didn't address that. Most analysts would argue that the deregulation has had a very negative effect, and the Telecommunications Act didn't create greater competition, which its proponents really said would happen. Really had a very negative effect, and I would agree with that. I think it's been very negative. You know, just as an example, it's a little bit of an offshoot from our discussion, but with this deregulation, there was this belief that you'd have all these choices for cable networks, and that hasn't happened at all. The only thing that happened is that, as economists had pledged even over 20 years ago when the statute was passed, that the startup cost for developing a cable network would be so high nobody would get in. Nobody got in. So now in most areas we really only have one, maybe two choices for cable television. The only real rival to cable TV is satellite TV, all right, and even if that. Okay, just one last note about the role of profits in news reporting and media. And this kind of gets us back to this idea of, you know, this tension between what they know will sell and sell well versus kind of like the social conscious, well, maybe it won't sell as well, but this is what we need to do, okay? Now, when you think about the role of profits, right, there's really 2 points of view. The libertarian view is really let the free market play its role, right? The idea being, well, if people don't like what we're reporting, we'll just go out of business, right? We'll show the media, we'll show the public what we think the public wants. If the public changes their mind, then we'll change our mind. But under the libertarian view, media shouldn't go out of their way to be socially responsible, if you will, okay? In other words, if the viewers want violence and sex, we're going to give them violence and sex. All right, the social responsibility view is just the opposite, right? The idea is that the media should go out of its way to make sure that the programming is designed to help people, but again, from the network or newspaper's point of view, right? What's socially responsible certainly has a qualitative weight to it in the sense that a TV station, radio station, or a newspaper would have to decide for themselves what's socially responsible and kind of put that out there for the public. Now, in the end, whether it's the libertarian view or the social responsibility view, all right, if people aren't listening to you or reading you, you will go out of business, all right? Because there is no government subsidy for media. The one exception would be public television and public radio, which are under threat almost every 4 years. But nonetheless, again, if you're not reporting what people want, you will go out of business. Advertisers will not buy print space or web space or airtime on your TV and radio stations if you don't have a group listening to you, okay? But again, the libertarian view will give the public what it wants. Social responsibility view, well, we should make sure that what we put out there is socially responsible, kind of adding to the quality and value of life. Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. That finishes the chapter on media, and we'll pick up with political parties on Wednesday. See you then.